live from Toronto on the Gbkm network. This is the Chat Up Show, the show where we chat about any and everything to do with popular culture and your weekly news. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aloyde, and I hope that you are ready to chat it up with me today. As always, you can keep up with the Gbkm network in various ways. You can listen to our web radio 24/7 at www.gbkm.fm. You can watch us live on Facebook and YouTube at Gbkm Tv, and you can follow us on Insta at GBKMFM and Twitter at GBKM_FM. Now, another week has gone down. We're here again. We're at the Chat Up Show. I'm excited. It's fun. But wow, 2020 has been a year for the books. Am I right? I know that it's going to be a year that I will never forget. Honestly, how could I? There's been so much that's happened. The pandemic being one of the major things that's happened, I think, to start the decade. I mean, what a way to start the new decade, right? And with that, I know that there are going to be so many stories that are shared about how people dealt with the pandemic, about how our governments dealt with people dealing with the pandemic, and how it's affected so many lives, so many industries across the globe. And these might be stories that we'll hear our future generations talking about in their history lessons. Who knows, masks might become new artifacts in museums across the world. But all this to say that there are so many stories that are shared and told, so many go untold. And that is the same throughout history. There's so many stories in history that we don't get a chance to hear because of who have essentially been the gatekeepers for so long. Now, today is a special day because we have a guest in studio with us. And I'm so excited to have Josh Dyer, who is Director of Marketing at Museum of Toronto, here in studios with us. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I will say you are our first guest since the pandemic. I'm excited, ready to go.
You're one of the first people I've seen outside of my home since the pandemic, so...
Look at that.
Yeah.
An episode of firsts, right?
Exactly.
So today we're going to be talking about what you do at Museum of Toronto, discussing a little bit more about it. So can we just start from there? What is Museum of Toronto?
Museum of Toronto is a museum without walls. We're a city museum that looks at the stories and history of Toronto. We do that in a bit of an unconventional way. For one, we don't have a space, we don't have a building to come to, so our exhibits are often sort of done in a pop-up format across the city. Usually we try to connect those exhibits to the communities that they represent. Right. Our programs are sort of the same thing. So we don't have a space where we host our programs from. We show up at venues all across the city to sort of to host programming and discussions of all kinds. On top of that, we also are unconventional in some ways in terms of the types of stories we tell. Right. We definitely have a bit more of a focus on underrepresented and marginalized communities, and sort of looking at somewhat of a gap that we find in the city's history, and trying to fill that in. Working with a lot of the communities, a lot of BIPOC communities from across the city, and working with them to really provide a platform for them to tell their story. That's essentially what we do.
We're going to go on a quick commercial break with that quick intro, and we will be right back with more from Josh Dyer on the Chat Up Show.
As the world fights this coronavirus, we are standing together as a family.
My name is Kelly. I'm a fan of Gbkm.
My name is Pastor Clement Omozane.
I'm Medea, your red carpet host.
I am your host, Ellen Roxon, for the show Talk That Talk here on Gbkm.
I'm a mother and a teacher. I stand with everyone at this time.
Hi, my name is OJ Ebobo, co-host of the King's Domain.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Aloyde, the host of the Chat Up Show on Gbkm.
My name is Kenny Bazwai, President and CEO, Gbkm FM and TV. We stand with all the community affected by this pandemic.
Welcome back to the Chat Up Show. I'm joined here with Josh Dyer, who is Director of Marketing at the Museum of Toronto. Now, Josh was just giving us a rundown of what exactly this museum with no walls is. And it's great to hear the work that you're doing. I think that especially when thinking of museums, you think a building that's probably old and has a lot of old stuff in it. But that's not necessarily the only type of history that's out there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, also one thing that we know about even sort of just this premise of museums being this space and having these buildings is also, to many communities, these are seen as sort of like elitist places where they don't necessarily feel welcomed.
Yeah.
And so that's also a way that we've looked at sort of overcoming that obstacle by sort of bringing the museum to the community. Instead of having this elaborate space where people don't necessarily feel that they're welcomed or that their community is well represented there. And so that's sort of been one of the ways that we've looked to sort of overcome what are some of the I guess the challenges for a lot of museums as we enter sort of the 21st century and as we see a lot of these societal shifts.
Yeah. Especially now, I think, because the conversation, especially around museums and the information they hold, it's often one-sided and you don't get the picture, and it's not from the people whose stories being shared. And so how would you say museum's presence in the city impacts communities that are often marginalized, their stories are unheard, and how this is like an opportunity for them to have a platform to share these stories?
I guess one of the really important, I think there's sort of two really important goals in terms of what we're doing. One is to create a better sense of social cohesion in our city. And so if you look at the history of Toronto, we like to laud ourselves as Torontonians as being, the most diverse city in the world. But if you look at the stories of the city, you do not see that diversity represented. And so, I think it's an important piece of social cohesion that the people who live here see themselves represented in the stories of the city. And so by sort of providing a platform for communities to tell their stories and really take pride in sort of some of the accomplishments their communities have had in the city and really show the impact that they've had in the city. For one, that just sort of helps create a better sense of social cohesion, a better sense of belonging. And two, for the people outside of those communities, is really to build more empathy for some of the struggles and obstacles that some communities have had. And so, if you get to hear this story from, and also in that way we get to tell and really hear much more personal stories. So the stories have like a face, they have a name. It's not sort of some guy behind a wall interpreting somebody's story for them, but you get to hear it directly from the story. And I think for people who are witnessing that and they're not part of that specific community, the whole point there is that, we hope that when you leave one of our exhibits or one of our events that you can reflect on that and really begin to empathize a bit more for your neighbors and the other people in the city.
I mean, I think we can see that empathy is very much needed in today's world, especially when dealing with people who are different from ourselves and just engaging, especially in a city that's so diverse like Toronto now. Knowing that they're people from different cultural backgrounds, they have different traditions and values that they hold dear, but that's what really comes together to create the city that we're in. And to hear these stories and have them on display and accessible as well, which is another thing, because I know that I didn't go to museums growing up unless it was for a school field trip and it was like paid for. I thought that museums were where fancy people went to go hang out and have like cocktail galas or something, and it's just where all this expensive stuff is stored and who knows where it comes from, who knows how it got there. I mean, now of course we're learning more a bit about how a lot of these artifacts end up in museums, and I think that especially now the conversation around especially that, how artifacts end up in museums is changing a little bit more and being more open and honest about it.
Yeah, you touched on a couple things there. I think accessibility is huge, at least for, I think a lot of museums are trying to sort of shift their models so that they can be more accessible, but for my museum, all of our programs, all of our events, and all of our exhibits have always been free. And so that's always been sort of like one sort of obstacle of accessibility that we've always tried to sort of achieve from the very beginning. And then in terms of in terms of the artifacts, I mean, it's been a discussion for a couple of years now, and I think is getting a lot more attention. I'm not sure how close we are to sort of like seeing that sort of mitigated in some way. I think there, in like very few cases, there has been some things that have been sort of returned to I guess what you could call the rightful owners.
Yeah, I know that even in BC, the Royal BC Museum is like trying to give back remains and artifacts to the Indigenous communities that have been asking for it. Even then, it's like so much time, and people have been asking for this for so long, and it's still taking a little bit of time for people to catch up.
Yeah, it can be difficult. There's also, I mean, often these things end up in sort of legal battles. And so I do know some cases stemming back to the Holocaust, actually, where Jewish families who were either forced to sell some of their belongings and artwork and stuff like that have been able to sort of like legally show that this was my great grandfather's, but then it goes to this whole sort of like legal implication. But I think aside, I mean, who owns the artifacts is one thing. But then there's a whole other issue of in terms of who gets to create the narrative behind the artifact. So you'll have this museum, and they'll have this elaborate collection of artifacts, and so not only is it that they likely don't necessarily own those artifacts, but also who the curator is and who's sort of telling the story of those artifacts. Often also isn't from that community. And so it's also just like being able to control the narrative. And so I think, I mean, obviously, I think it's simpler for us at my museum because it's a bit more on a local scale. We're just sort of like focused on one city, but that's also something that we've always tried to do, is ensure that that when we're telling a story that it's not our voice, but rather it's the community's voice that's being sort of shown through that.
I think that's one thing that really like grabbed my attention with my museum is even with Ask an Elder, it's you're getting the chance to break those boundaries and those walls that generally would be up, between the Indigenous community and I guess everyone else in Toronto. That there seems to be a disconnect. But having the opportunity to actually like speak and have that intimate experience with an elder of the Indigenous community is something different, and it's a different way to experience history and to experience these stories being told.
Yeah, and I think as for that program, I think you really nailed it. That's something that we put together. For one, we know there's a huge appetite, not just in the city but across Canada, for people to know more about Indigenous culture and history, because it's something that I'm not an expert on the current curriculum in Toronto, but I do know that when I was going to school back in the 80s and 90s, we didn't learn hardly anything about sort of Indigenous cultures, and even if we did, it was sort of these stereotypical tropes, and so there's this huge appetite that people they want to know more, because they want to know first of all, they want to know the real history behind that, and they want to know sort of like how they should be navigating these current day issues in our society, because you need a bit of a historical context. And one thing that we realize is that most people have zero contact with Indigenous people in our city, and so we worked with Elder Duke Redbird. We started a program with him last year, where we teamed up and created this boat that was stationed at the marina at Ontario Place, and really just invited the public. They could come down and visit Duke at the boat, and he would sort of have conversations. They ask him any questions he wants, and this year, due to coronavirus, we sort of formalized that a bit more, and so now we have this program called Ask an Elder, where you can sign up online on our website, mymuseumoftoronto.com, and you can book a time slot, and then you basically get like a one-on-one Zoom conversation with an Indigenous elder, and the conversations, they can be about history, they can be about culture, but also, I mean, Duke is 81 years old. He's also just like lived what seems like many lives, and he's an artist, he's a poet, sort of like a multi-potentialite in many ways, and the conversations can really go any direction. But he just often always provides a little bit of that. That the conversation always has this, you know, this indigenous perspective behind it, which is important. Then also, I think one thing that you were just talking about in terms of like how people view museums is we also try to do things that you're just not typically going to see in a museum or as a part of a museum. And so a few weeks ago we hosted a program called Women in Hip Hop. And it was basically a bunch of female rappers from across Toronto who sort of spoke about their experiences as Black women and how sort of, you know, many of the obstacles that they face even within that music industry of sort of like getting you know, fair and equal treatment. But you know, that's those. I mean, right there, there's sort of like I think two things that we don't see enough of.
Especially like hip hop and like women and like Black women as well being the main part of the story. Like, yeah, that's not something you see, I think, just even outside of museums a lot of the time in media even. Yeah.
Well, the crazy thing is, I mean, you know, especially Black women are like drivers of pop culture, but are not really given credit for it. And then so there's that whole thing. And then I just think museums have done a really poor job of connecting their stories and their narratives to pop culture, where they're obviously all connected, and I think, you know, that's something that we also try to do, because the pop culture conversations are also important in the historical context.
Yeah, like they're shaping what we now, I think, I mean, social media, like that's considered pop culture, right? And so much happens on these platforms that drives the like overall narrative about a lot of things. And I think that taking note of that is something that a lot of museums, as you said, have like been lacking in. And when you walk into these conventional museums, you see pretty much the same stuff. So you're getting like your Africa, maybe a little bit of Asia, like your dinosaurs, the fossils, like that. But you're not really getting these in-depth stories, as you said, like from the horse's mouth, essentially. People who are telling their own stories instead of someone else saying it for them.
Yeah, I think you raised a good point in that, you know, I also think museums rely too much on their collection. So like their collection of artifacts, and that's not always the best way to tell the story. Or if you have an artifact and you want to tell the story of that artifact, maybe just, you know, like a text on a wall is not going to do it. And so that's why, you know, we've also been getting a lot more into sort of performance arts and even looking at like things like live storytelling and just, you know, an actual, even if this historical object has great meaning, you sometimes need to do a bit more to sort of really give credit to the story behind it. And yeah, I think that's one thing that museums and some are, but many are sort of relying too much on just like, come look at this old thing. And it's like, okay, but you can make that story more exciting.
And then it's even thinking like, what is history? Is it history that's like happened centuries ago, or is it like what happened the last decade? What, like, who gets to pick what is considered history?
That is such a good question. We did a program. It was last year. It seems like this year, but this year's flown by. So it was last year. It was called Documenting Diverse Histories, and it really came out of, you know, what has been something that we've struggled with as a museum who seeks to tell these stories. Is, for one, it can be difficult to find the records, so like historical records, historical artifacts, to tell some of the stories that we know are out there. And one of the difficult things is often people who are a part of these communities that, you know, that we would like to, that we see an interesting story in, you don't always see your own story as something of importance. So you're not really necessarily documenting your life like an archive in some way. And so, it's been sort of a difficult thing, because the institutional sort of archives aren't, I think they're definitely trying to do a better job, but historically they haven't done a great job of collecting objects and records that are representative of the actual population of the city. And then if you go to the actual community and you're like, do you guys have any sort of like documents or objects that reflect this history? they're often like, no, because we didn't really think it was important at the
Important,
time. And then we realized that, it's more important now than it was. It seems more important now than it seemed back then. And then, I mean, I think along that same point, Heritage Toronto, every few years they do this report called the State of Heritage, and so because I think you're sort of talking about gatekeepers, and and a part of their last report, I think in 2019, they did a bit of a survey of sort of the I guess what you could call sort of like the ethnic makeup of Toronto's museums and archives and galleries, and you look. I don't have the exact numbers, but you're looking at something like somewhere between 2 and 4% of the staff at these institutions that are people of color. And it's not to say you have to be a person of color to tell these other stories, but I think what it comes down to is sort of like maybe a bit of an inherent bias. For one, you just won't necessarily know about the other stories.
Because you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly, exactly. And then also, I think we all feel that we're connected in some way to a proud and important lineage. But if you have everybody who's sort of from a similar lineage, they're just going to keep on bringing up sort of the same stories. So you need to get some different life in there, so that the more diverse stories come to life.
And you were saying before that a lot of people don't think that it's important to hold on to their personal historical artifacts, but then on the other side, you'll go visit your grandparent and they have all these letters from back in the day when their partner went off to war and they were writing all these love letters, and you're thinking, why isn't this in a museum? This is so interesting. This is a slice of life from back in the day when so much was going on, especially in the civil rights movement. Seeing parents, grandparents, all the kids who were growing up during that time and how they were dealing compared to now. It's having those physical memories of history is interesting.
It's a huge undercoming, I think, and really, I mean, typically who does that work are the archives. So in Toronto we have the City of Toronto Archives, and also the Archives of Ontario, and then there's the Library and Archives Canada, and so I think we would hope that our institutional archives would be doing that kind of sort of community-based investigation and record keeping. The reality is that they're not, and not always because they don't want to, often just because they don't have the resources to do it, and in a sort of more, and what I guess is a more sad case is that it's not even their mandate to do so. And so the first thing is it's a huge undercoming. So you have community-based archives that have now started popping up that do that same work. A great example here in Toronto is called the Archives. They used to be called the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives of Canada, but this just came out of that community basis, saying like nobody is keeping track of our histories and our stories, and so they started doing it themselves. So you have these sort of community-based archives that have popped up that are now trying to do that work.
But it's not enough.
But it's not enough. And there have been some great crowdsourcing sort of initiatives in terms of like the National Museum for African American History and Culture in the U.S. That's one of the things that they did. They basically sort of like they reached out to this network of African American museums across the U.S. And they basically said like, what do you have in your sort of community-based collection, and then sort of like sifted through all that. And I think they also just had this whole like really crowdsourced campaign where you could just like send stuff in, and they did a really incredible job of sourcing the stories for that museum. But I remember reading about it. You're talking about like a decade-long like massive undertaking to find these things, because there's every grandma has these letters and photos in their basement, but we can't visit everyone's grandma's basement. So it's I mean, I'm not an archivist, and so I definitely somebody who's a professional archivist definitely would have a better understanding of how that stuff is done. But definitely something that we're lacking in just as a society,
the board, yeah.
capacity to record these stories.
Now, I want to go back to our discussion on like gatekeeping of stories, because when I went to journalism school, we were told that journalists were the gatekeepers of stories. But as you know, we start thinking critically about the media and what's put out in the media, we're recognizing that it's not as objective. So there's the biases that's put in the media, which then also affect the overall narrative of these stories. And so if we're looking back at like newspaper clippings and archives of things that were printed back in the day, like reading them now, you're thinking that is kind of problematic.
Yeah, you really have to reinterpret, and so I find we end up doing that a lot, especially we dig through the archives for a lot of our social posts. We try to sort of often, again, look at things that are happening in pop culture and society, and then dig into the archives and find sort of like similar events, and so you can sort of connect them and create this discussion around them. And yeah, you'll find that a lot, that you have to sort of recontextualize what you've found. I mean, in Canada, I think one of the the big issues is how we've documented the lives and the stories of Indigenous peoples. Because we've tried to sort of find sort of historical images that sort of like that represent the history of Indigenous peoples, but even just the way the imagery is taken, it's taken in a way to sort of demean this subject, and which is really unfortunate. So even when you go into the archives and you find something, I mean, that is a whole other really interesting topic, and I shouldn't get into it too much because it's not my expertise, but I would love to connect you with again, like a professional archivist, because also there's this whole theory that that archives and the way that we record and document things, they come out of this colonial legacy, and so there is even this this colonial agenda in terms of how we even sort of record the stories of people, and so they are recorded from a colonial perspective, and they're recorded and documented again in a way that doesn't necessarily fit how we would look at these stories today.
One story, I guess, that springs to mind from you just saying that is the story of Sarah Bartman, or Sarch J. Bartman, who was taken. I mean, some will say that legally taken, others will say stolen, depending on which side of the discussion you're looking at it. And she was essentially taken from South Africa to England to be this living statue that people could come from afar to come pay money to just look at, to see how her body was the way it was, because it was so foreign to people in England. And then to know that she died in like 1815 and her skeletal remains weren't brought back to South Africa until 2002. So that's like a whole other, and like even the story about like her death, like to it, or even just her life stories, the more you dig into it, the more you find actual I guess archives, if you will, from South Africa telling her side of the story a little bit more. So you're hearing, it's kind of conflicting with what we've been taught before about what really happened with this woman and what her life story was, and the torture that she endured, and even the pictures, as you said, the pictures that you see that are like scientific, but they're really dehumanizing. And that's all you're fed, essentially. And that's the narrative that you're going to carry on in your life, that it's like, oh, it's normal to like treat people this way. I mean, not normal, but it was acceptable to treat people this way back in the day. So why am I, again, bringing up empathy, going to be empathetic to someone talking about something that's not as harsh in today's society? Like, at least like when people bring up racism, it's like, oh, at least you're not getting lynched every single day. And it's like, oh, but at the base level now?
I mean, that story is definitely one of the more alarming stories, and it touches on like a multiple levels of like who controls that narrative, and even also sort of artifacts being returned to their rightful place. There's a lot there. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
a lot. I dumped a lot on you there.
Yeah, it's I mean it's an interesting time. One thing, maybe to bring it back just a little bit. One thing that I do know is the Smithsonian Museum in the U.S. One thing that they're currently working on is how they can collect some of the artifacts from the protests all across the U.S. Which has been difficult because they all happened during coronavirus. So they're actually asking people in a lot of Black communities across the country to like keep your signs, keep anything that you had made for these protests, because they do want to collect them, because they're. I mean, that was obviously an important turning point in American history, and it's going to be important to sort of have these objects that speak to that moment.
I was joking at the beginning of the show when I said that masks may become artifacts, but they probably will.
Legitimately.
Like now that I say it, sounds like silly a little bit to say that out loud, but like this is part of history now.
Yeah.
And it's kind of weird to kind of be cognizant of that as we're living it, that this is a monumental period in time. I mean, the protests, if we're going to speak about that, those have been going like over a month now, and there doesn't seem like they're letting up. That in itself is powerful. And so then to think that this is just going to be forgotten in history, it's like hard to imagine that.
I think at least for myself, like I guess it depends on where people come to it from, but yeah, I think from the onset I was like, this is historical. Yeah. We will look back. I mean, I just think 2020 we're going to look back on as like a I don't know how we're going to see it, but it's going to take up a good piece of history textbooks, I think, when we look back, when our great-great-grandchildren are looking at history. 2020 is going to fill a whole chapter.
Yeah, we're going to be the grandparents with the basements full of like all these masks and artifacts. That's like, come look at what we have.
Exactly.
Here's my journal entry that I wrote on my notes app back in the day.
I mean, that's a whole other thing, in terms of our lives are also sort of like digitally recorded in at the moment, and who knows how that turns out. I mean, I'm pretty sure I probably still have a MySpace page somewhere. I was big on Black Planet like way back in the day. I don't even know if that's
I don't know what that is.
Oh, wow, I'm probably showing my age. It was, but yeah, like there were all these like former social networks that we're not necessarily using anymore, but there's a whole like catalog of our lives on there, which is also going to be interesting. It might make it much easier to sort of do the research and figure out the histories that are there.
And even speaking of like how everything is digitalized, bringing it back to my museum, I think because it's already so accessible and already stuff is like online that you could look at, like how have you been able to transport exhibits to the virtual space because of COVID?
That has been, I think in some ways it was a little bit easier for us because that's already been something we've been really working on. Not having it because we don't have a space. Yeah. We always want to make sure that when we're doing some sort of like exhibit, that it doesn't just feel ephemeral, and so. Looking at new ways to really sort of record content from these exhibits and the conversations that happen around them. And so that's already something we've been really working on. We were like just April 1st, we were supposed to start what is definitely like our biggest like event of the year. It's this like month-long arts and culture festival. And so we had to sort of cancel that, and then we had a bunch of sort of like back and forth conversations with all of the sort of community partners that we were working on that event for, and really just held these conversations because we were supposed to have 12 exhibits happen just across the city just in the month of April.
Wow.
And so we started these conversations with each community partner and basically say like, we would love to find a way to display this exhibit or host the conversations around it online. But then one thing that we quickly realized is, the topic that the community was going to host through that exhibit isn't necessarily the important topic of the day after COVID hit, and so we had to sort of, for one, evolve the subject matter of all of the exhibits and all of the events, which I think was, worked very much to our favor, because then it allowed this outlet for people who are sort of stuck in their homes and wanted to engage with others and wanted to sort of hear about things that are happening around the city. To I guess in some ways we sort of became like a bit of like a news media outlet in some, on behalf of like the arts and culture community. And so we shifted all of our exhibits and programs to speak more to the moment, which I think we always try to do, but right as it was happening, like times were changing, and so we're sort of like had to shift everything. And then other than that, that we basically had like 4 to 6 weeks to figure out how to do programs completely online and find ways to create some sort of like engaging conversation over Zoom, for instance. But it's been, I think that we achieved far more than we had set out to. I think the first we had like a number in mind of like, okay, how many people can we get on this like first sort of like Zoom panel discussion, and we like far exceeded those numbers, and so it's been really positive in that regard, and I think we've been rather successful in sort of like navigating that shift. And I think just again going back to the protests, for instance, we're continuing to try to stay as nimble as possible in terms of what conversations we are holding and how we sort of proceed. And so for instance, shameless plug, next week, July 23rd, we have a program that I'm really excited about. It's called Over Policing Black and Indigenous Lives.
I do want to talk to you about that, but we're going to take a quick break because I want to dive into that conversation a little bit more with you. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and once we're back with Josh Dyer, we're going to dive into that conversation. So stay tuned.
Do you believe you could host an entertaining, engaging, and thoughtful weekly show? Or are you a business person or entrepreneur interested in building a brand for yourself? Can you connect with an audience and have strong social media skills? If so, the Gbkm Network would love to invite you to join our team. We're looking for driven, genuine folks who are willing to card as an independent broadcaster. If this sounds like you, come join our team. For more information, email your resume to career@gbkm.fm. That is career, CAREER, @gbkm.fm. It's time to turn your passion into a career. Do you believe you could host an entertaining, engaging, and thoughtful weekly show? Or are you a business person?
Welcome back to the Chat Up Show. I'm joined here in studios with Josh Dyer, who is the Director of Marketing of Museum of Toronto. Now, before we went on the break, we were kind of talking about this event that's coming up next week. If you could just give us a little bit of a tease of what that is.
Yeah, so I mean, again, we were sort of looking at all the things that were happening in the world, and then we've been trying to make our programming and the conversations we use, our platform, we tell on our platform, to be, really fit the moment. And so the protests were happening, and I mean, there was just so much going on. So at first we sort of like stepped back and took some time to sort of just, I think, also really let the organizations that were like on the ground lead the way, but knew that there was some important discussions that needed to be had. And so next week, July 23rd, that's next Thursday, we're hosting a panel discussion called Over Policing Black and Indigenous Lives. On the panel will be Sandra Hudson, who's the founder of Black Lives Matter Canada, or Black Lives Matter Toronto, Robin Maynard, who wrote this incredible book called Policing Black Lives, and it's to my knowledge probably like the most extensive sort of and comprehensive analysis of sort of racial profiling and policing in the Canadian context.
That's something you don't always get to hear about. You always hear it in like the American context, but stuff's happening here too. Exactly.
Yes. And then we also have a representative from Aboriginal Legal Services. And yeah, really just, I think that's one of the big points of the conversation, is to be like, these are not just things that are happening in the US, because that's something that I think, which got a lot of press at the moment when the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, came out and sort of tried to play it off like this is just that's an American thing.
Yeah.
This isn't a problem here, when we know for sure it is. And one thing about it, one thing that is sort of helpful in some way is that because the police take a lot of records. They write reports for everything. So this history of racism within our police forces right here in Toronto is well documented. And then there's and even if you get into those documents, you get into the numbers. We know things like I think I'm not sure if it's black men or just black people in general in Toronto are 20 times more likely to be victims of fatal police shootings. Aboriginal people in Canada make up something like 12 times their proportion of the Canadian population in terms of how many of them are incarcerated. And so black and Indigenous people in Toronto and in Canada are targets of our police services. And so that's sort of a whole conversation we want to get into, and it goes all the way back to the Mounties and sort of what their purpose was in many ways. Yeah.
And I think that's just even speaking about that, you said the history of police brutality against BIPOC folks, and there is a history there that's not told a lot of the time, and it gets swept under the carpet. And then also because America's this loud voice in the media that's all it's everywhere to see, you hear about it. Even American history, I feel like I know more about American history than I do my own history. And so that becomes I guess the comparative measure, what they can compare and contrast against. At least it's not as bad as there.
We found the worst kid in the class. And we're well, at least my grades aren't as bad as this guy. For sure. And it's something that I think has gone on for too long. We've compared our sort of dark histories to America's and sort of just said they're not as bad. They don't warrant a conversation. And we've done the same thing with slavery in Canada. There was slavery right here in Toronto, and it's also something that's well documented. And we have the owners of those slaves. We celebrate them in our street names, monuments. Same with the people who perpetuated and celebrated their residential schools that basically kidnapped Indigenous children. We are, and it's not. And the thing is, we're not celebrating these men because they were slave owners and because they were perpetuating residential schools, but the fact of the matter is that we know that is the case now, and we have an opportunity, and some would say an obligation, to address that. And also, I guess one of my big things is, why are there no street names or monuments about the people who are trying to abolish slavery?
Questions
where
that
are
need
the
answers.
abolitionists? You know what I mean? We don't even talk about them, but there were people who dedicated their lives to really sort of moving into the next phase of our history. And so, but we spent so much time sort of focused on the people that were sort of on the wrong side of history, and we haven't even given much credit to the people who were leading the charge.
And that speaks to who holds the narrative in their hands and who gets to share these stories. And for so long, as you said, it's been colonialized, essentially. History is very colonialized, that we're really only hearing the stories of colonizers from their perspective, or it's from what other people who are, I guess, have ancestors who were colonizers, and then they decide that they want to take it upon themselves to go back and learn what they've done. And then it's still a disconnect from the actual story, if you will.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think we often forget about Canada's colonial history, because I think we often think of colonial histories as the people who were sort of the core colonizers, and I guess technically Canada was a colony of the UK, but we did our own colonizing here of the Indigenous people's space and lands, and then even how we've treated others as they've gotten here. We've sort of perpetuated many of the behaviors that we've learned from our forefathers. And so I think it's something that's not really paid enough attention to, is this sort of this colonial legacy that Canada has. Yeah.
Would you say that now there's really no excuse to turn a blind eye to this history, that
like the city holds a lot of history, like especially with everything that's digitalized. You can Google at like your fingertips, it's all there, the information, if you really want to seek it out. Even with Museum, it's accessible, so it's not like you have to like go into a building. Now you have like the virtual conversations that are happening, and there's opportunity to educate yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact of the matter is it's going to change. Like even just the demographics of a city like Toronto are changing so fast, and that it will be very difficult to not tell stories that represent the people who live here, because very soon the people who, you know, all of the children of immigrants who were born here or came here when they were young are going to be of age and are going to be in the workforces. I mean, that's a whole other conversation of like whether we give them opportunities to be the gatekeeper themselves.
That's true.
But it is going to change. But it's just sort of, you know, how long do we want to wait? And do we just want to like sit back passively and like hope it changes at some point? I mean, that's not how I see myself and my role in this. It is really, I think, to expedite these things. But yeah, I think that helps the conversation is like, it's gonna change. So like, what are you even holding on to? You know, why even hold back? Because this is all gonna come out. You know what I mean? Like, and they're just important conversations to have. It doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we're not rewriting what our history is. We're not erasing people from history books, but we are now putting a disclaimer of like, oh, by the way, this guy also owned slaves and did a few terrible things. And so, you know, if now this was the man, and also here's the whole story. But yeah, we've done just a lot of whitewashing, I guess, like both in figuratively speaking and technically same thing. But we've washed away the sins of some of these people, and there's just more of a conversation to be had there. And it's not that, you know, that they're necessarily terrible people, and it's not that we just like erase them from history and rewrite the history books, but it's just like, I think, you know, something that it's an appendix to what's already there.
And I think that's an important point, because I see with these conversations happening on social media, you hear a lot of people, it's like, why are you trying to change history? And it's like, we're not. This is what happened. It's just that it wasn't taught. So now you think that we're making it up, but here are all the receipts if you need them to show all the facts, like all the archives, like this is stuff that really did happen.
Yeah, it's really, we're just trying to tell a more complete story. And then on top of that, though, I think on top of just getting the narrative behind some of the people that we already celebrate or commemorate in Canadian and Toronto's history, for one, we need to have a more accurate representation of that, but then also those history books just need to be more representative. They need to include more people of color. They need to speak to the achievements of those people. They need to speak to how these communities have impacted Toronto. It's just going back to the diversity thing, it blows me away that, you know, we have all these, you have an African diaspora, South Asian diaspora, Chinese diaspora, and most of us don't know anything about like the histories of those communities that are here and the impact that they've had on Toronto. But obviously they have. If you have, you know, 100,000 South Asian people, they've obviously impacted the city. So why don't we talk about how that is and who are the community leaders in those communities and stuff like that? But not enough of it's being done. Yeah,
there's still some work to be done. But as you said, it's changing, and it's happening slowly but surely. I mean, I think that we're all thinking, why hasn't this been more widely adopted? Like telling these quote unquote untold stories or unheard stories. Why people aren't feeling the need to seek it out more, or just tell these stories more out on greater platforms than it's already being done. And it really brings the question, it's like, what is the agenda? Like, why are you trying to hide it? I mean, I know, because there's a lot of stuff out there, but history, we don't want history to repeat itself. So why ignore a part of it and then look at where we are now? There's so much change, but really it hasn't in a lot of situations, i.e. police departments.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, going back to this conversation of gatekeepers, gatekeepers exist on like multiple levels. You know what I mean? There's people just in your general management, But then there's people who are on the boards.
Yeah.
There's CEOs. There's people who aren't even CEOs, but they're like former CEOs who have a lot of sway over a certain organization, and so it's just I think a lot of it comes down to gatekeepers. I mean, interesting sort of conversation along that line. One thing that we have seen makes real change is money.
Yeah.
I think it's a similar conversation to look at the football team in the U.S., the Washington Redskins, and the owner there in 1999 said we're never changing the name. It's not going to happen. And then there's been decades now of indigenous groups saying like, no, you need to change it, and still nothing happened. And he just was like flat out no. But then like Pepsi and Nike and FedEx, they showed up and they're like, no money from us if you don't change. And so I guess to bring that back to the sort of like to the museum context and at a place like Toronto, like maybe that's where the change comes from. Is who are the sort of like funders and patrons of these institutions, and for them to basically say like, yeah, we used to donate a bunch of money to this museum, but unless you change things, no more
money.
Yeah, we're shutting off the tap. But I mean, again, let's see if the gatekeepers in a city like Toronto are at that stage quite yet.
I mean, because money does talk, right? So now, before we let you go, I do want to know if you can pick from your brain full of facts, what is the most interesting fact about Toronto that's really not widely known?
I mean, I find it interesting, definitely not the most important.
Okay.
But there's a really interesting connection between Rick James and Toronto. So Rick James, I mean, people might know him from, you should know him from your music, but if you're young enough, you probably know him from the Chappelle Show. And the skits with Charlie Murphy, Eddie Murphy's brother. But essentially, Rick James was a draft dodger during the Vietnam War in the U.S., and he's from Detroit, which is right across the border. And so he didn't want to go to Vietnam, so he came across the border to Canada. And he was basically living in Yorkville at the time, which was not Yorkville of today. It was like hippies and musicians, and he was like playing cafes and singing cafes in Yorkville. And then met up with no other than, I guess, Canadian folk legend, I guess you would call him, Neil Young.
Yep.
And so Neil Young and Rick James had a band here in Toronto together called the Mina Birds, which
interesting fact.
And then that all ended. They I think the story goes. There's some music historian who might correct me on this, but I think the way the story goes is they were essentially invited by Motown back in Detroit to go down there and record. And so they went back to Detroit, but in crossing the border, getting back into the U.S., they caught Rick James, then caught him as a draft dodger, and he ended up doing like a year or two in prison actually for that. But yeah, it's such a bizarre thing to see Rick James and Neil Young as young people, and think of them as young people just like hanging out on
starting
Bloor
a band
on Bloor Street.
That's interesting. That is an interesting fact.
Yeah,
I think it's important, part of Toronto history. But before we go, I do want to give a little update on what we've got here at the network. We have our own little mask, so you can stay protected while looking cool, looking fly, okay? Now, if you want to get yourself one of these cute little dandy masks, you can DM us on Instagram at GBKMFM, or you can email us at admin@gbkm.fm. Again, you can either DM us on Instagram to get you one of these snazzy little masks at GBKMFM, or email us at admin@gbkm.fm. So join our team with a cool little mask like this. Now, before we let you go, thank you so much, Josh, for joining us today on the Chat Up Show. Thank you for kicking off our new series of gatekeeping history and gatekeeping stories, and who has the right to tell our stories, right?
Yeah, I thank you for having me, and I'm really excited. I'm glad you guys are sort of taking this initiative on and diving into this. I will definitely be paying attention to see who the next guests are. And last little plug. July 23rd, over policing Black and Indigenous lives. It's going to be, I think it's a really important conversation, and we have just some great panelists, some really knowledgeable panelists that are going to really break that down of the history of sort of like racial profiling and policing in
That's
Toronto.
great. So how can people tune in, check that out?
MyZemeOfToronto.com, follow us on social, and also if you just want to keep up to date with what we're doing going down the road, you can subscribe to our newsletter. All of that you can do from the website or our Instagram account, MyZemeToronto, Facebook, MyZemeOfToronto, Twitter, MyZemeTO. Go to any one of those platforms and you'll find us, and you'll just subscribe to the newsletter and find out what's happening next.
There you go. So there you have it. Next week, Thursday, an important conversation on, I guess, the treatment of Black and Indigenous folks with the police.
Yeah.
It's definitely a hot topic right now.
It is. Yeah. The first ballot to defund or do a partial defunding of Toronto's police department didn't go through, but the conversation is definitely still there. People are still pressuring their city councillors, so that's something you can continue doing if you would like to.
Send your emails if you're about that life.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, and thank you all of you for tuning in and for joining in this conversation today with myself and Josh as we kind of dived a little bit, dipped our toe into the conversation of gatekeepers of stories and who has the right to tell your story. And, if you are one of the people out there who has a grandma with a basement full of archives, maybe it's time you hit up your grandma or...
Oh yeah, that's also, we're always trying to crowdsource stories. So if you have like objects, let us know about them, or even just a story idea. If there's something that we haven't shared and you think we should, hit us up. You can just DM us on social, hit us up on our info@myzemeoftoronto.com email. But yeah, we're always crowdsourcing stories. So if you got those photos from your grandma or your grandma just has some wild story that we should know about. We can't guarantee that we'll tell it, but we want to know about it. That's for sure.
That's for sure. Well, thank you so much again. And as always, you can keep up with the Gbkm network in various ways. As you know, you can listen 24/7 at www.gbkm.fm. You can watch live on Facebook and YouTube at Gbkm Tv. You can follow us on Insta at Gbkm FM and Twitter at Gbkm_FM. And you can follow me, your host, to get some updates about the show and all that fun stuff on Instagram and Twitter at TIS_Liz_O. And I hope that you guys take care. Again, if you are looking to get a mask for yourself or your friends, maybe you want to give them a little gift for protection, DM us on Instagram at GBKMFM or email us at admin@gbkm.fm. And with that, I will see you guys at the same time, same place next week. Take care and stay safe.
Entrepreneur interested in building a brand for yourself. Can you connect with an audience and have strong social media skills? If so, the Gbkm network would love to invite you to join our team. We're looking